There was a Muslim in Jerusalem who killed his own mother in anger, and when he's brought to trial, he says he acted under the influence of alcohol, and the judges decided that the local Jews and Christians are responsible because they're the only ones who make wine. So the Jews were fined 16 golden florins, the Christians were fined 12, and this Muslim guy went free. And just generally, bad harvests or plagues or drought, it was thought by the Muslims to be caused by the use of wine by Jews.
Welcome to History for the Curious. I'm Mena Reisner, and I host the internationally renowned lecturer, dynamic historian, and tour guide, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Experience our history, confront dilemmas, and reveal the untold stories of 3,000 years of Jewish heritage, from Paris to Cairo, from the Russian Tsar to Maimonides, and from the Sinai Revelation to the French Revolution. Join the fastest growing Jewish history podcast in the world by subscribing to this channel and discovering the events that have shaped us into who we are today.
This week's episode is dedicated by Five Towns Central, which is run by Ellie and Ariel Sonnenblick. They are the social media which puts your business in front of the entire Five Towns community and the area's sole digital news source from breaking news to local events. They have over 27,000 active followers on Instagram and 11,000 WhatsApp members on their groups, and they can be contacted at fivetownscentral.com or on 516-331-4228, and a link will be provided in the description below.
Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. Thank you to the sponsor. We are starting a brand new series this week, slightly different to our regulars. We have covered many eras, we've covered many biographies, and this is actually more of an object, wine. So we're going to be looking at wine historically. What was wine 2,000 years ago? Probably looks a bit different to the wine we're used to now. How was it produced? The challenges for wine in the Middle Ages, the differences between France, Spain, Italy, and everything in between. In week 2, we are going to have 2 very special guest speakers who have enormous background and knowledge of wine. We're honored that Yochi, otherwise known as Nathan Herzog, president of Kedem Wines, will be joining us. He's visiting London for a few days, and we will also be interviewing a Halachic expert too.
I will add that next week I also want to deal with the issues that arose out of prohibition in America in the 1920s, when you weren't allowed to buy wine at all, and there was an allowance made for religious purposes, almost going back to the era of the Muslims in the 15th century, and some of the issues that arose, and in fact some of the scandals that arose from that as well.
So, in the Torah, we find many references to the use and to the drinking of wine from the very beginning, from the story of Noach post the flood, the episode of Lot, and according to at least one opinion, the tree in Gan Eden was a vine. And of course, the communal korbanos were all accompanied by wine, but we don't know much about wine itself. The Torah tells us about wine, but doesn't give us much description. So, what was wine back then, Rabbi Hirsch?
We will start with a little insight into how wine came to be what it is today. And strangely, the oldest place to start is Georgia. And I don't mean the US state, but the country which has been producing wine for thousands of years, probably 4,000, and still produce some today in the way they always did. These are wines whose tastes are completely removed from the experience of normal modern wine, and they use methods that come to them through the ages. I read about a 2011 white Kisai grape, where they take the wine stems, the skins, everything, and they put them in a submerged clay jar for 6 months, and comes out bright orange, but apparently very tasty. So that is where we have still records going back. Then we come to Egypt, and although the pyramids aren't the first place you'd look to find a nation's drinking culture, Egypt's tombs weren't your normal tombs. They were filled with jars of wine, and the most famous is that of Tutankhamun, around 3,500 years ago, whose tomb held 36 jars of wine marked according to style, year, area of production, name of producer, As one example, we have year 4 wine of very good quality of the House of Aten on the Western River, Chief Vintner Kai. So vintage, quality, estate.
Wonder what it tasted like.
You'd need to travel back in time to find out, because these jars of wine were never opened and it's too late to drink them now.
Am I imagining it, or did we see bottles of wine in the British Museum when we went?
You didn't see bottles, you will have seen clay amphorae.
Right. There was something wine-related in the Egypt section.
Yes. Now, wine drinking was an upper-class activity in ancient Egypt, because the everyday drink was beer, but the Egyptians set down a number of principles that the Greeks and Romans followed, such as the development of amphorae, these tall earthenware jars which I mentioned. The bottom of these jars was pointed so they could be buried in sand and transported without breaking, and they had very narrow necks which were easily sealed in order to prevent air from getting to the wine. And then you have the Phoenicians, because they are probably to be credited with inventing glass. In this case, the vessel from which to drink the wine, but not the bottle. That wouldn't happen for many centuries afterwards. And from there we move to the Greek and Roman world, in particular Pompeii, which was Rome's main wine port.
Until the volcano exploded next door and Pompeii was fully destroyed.
It was covered in layers of lava, admittedly, and therefore inaccessible, and it killed everybody in the city, but it wasn't destroyed, because nowadays scientists, archaeologists remove the lava and they find a frozen in time, this town. And the slopes around Pompeii were dotted with working farms. There were villas where wealthy people had vineyards, and they have excavated and identified about 120 bars in the area. But wine in Roman times tasted very different, because, for instance, today we think that adding water to wine is, anathema. But for Greeks and Romans, it was almost the other way around. The civilized thing was to mix wine and water, and the ratios sort of signaled how sober the evening ahead was going to be. We have references to mixing wine and water proportions of 2-1, or sometimes as little as 20-1.
The Gemara in Psachim talks about wine being diluted by water when it comes to the 4 cups required, right?
Yes, and in the Beis HaMikdash itself, that's definitely, it was considered better not to have what they called raw wine. But in Rome, wine wasn't just water and grapes. It was basically something people felt entitled to doctor. You could throw in seawater or honey, and it wasn't scandalous, it was good practice. You have a number of books from back then which are full of recipes. Cato suggests adding brine made from salt and water, and even lining the jugs with pitch. And these additions served several purposes. They sweetened wine which was underripe, they added body, and they even had mild, antiseptic effects, and they helped wine survive in storage.
So all this counted as improvements. It wasn't like a form of deceit.
Yes, you only get to fraud if you, really dilute the wine behind the customer's back, or you fill your amphorae with cheap local wine and pass it off as, the best produce that there is. Now, soldiers drank what was called Posca, which is basically water spiked with sour wine or vinegar, and slaves got Eora, which was the second pressing, when you add water to grapes that have already been trodden. It's not really wine, but for the working class Romans, it was their daily drink.
So wine isn't a pleasurable experience like we're used to today. It was medicinal.
It was more than that. You didn't have tea or coffee back then. The water was often unsafe to drink as it was, and therefore beer and wine occupied a far larger space than they do today, and wine was used religiously. Hippocrates talks about it being used medically for washing wounds. I don't mean for drinking and keeping you in a state of stupor. And it was very unpredictable. It was a sort of a buyer beware market. There are no guarantees that you haven't bought vinegar. And the advice is that within 3 days you better taste it. In fact, the Gemara talks about this. Rav says that for 3 days after buying wine, the seller is still responsible if the wine turns sour, but after that, his amphorae, his responsibility comes to an end, whereas Shmuel says the responsibility falls on the person who buys the wine immediately, because the way it is put is wine rests on the owner's shoulders. There was an assumption that whenever you bought wine, that 10% of it would be sour or vinegar. And Rav Chia ben Yosef said, wine shares the owner's luck. And the Rashbam explains the Gemara statement that a proud person, a haughty person's wine goes bad because it's midah keneged midah. Just as a haughty person pretends he is something important and really he isn't, so the wine turning to vinegar shows that it isn't what it is assumed to be. In fact, by the time of the Gemara, wine 3 years old was considered old because it aged very badly. It was much earlier in time, when they still had sealed jugs, that they could keep wine for many years. We find that in Megillas Esther, the Sudas HaChashverosh, there were some very old wines, but then these jugs were replaced with wooden barrels, probably at the end of the 2nd century.
Why did they change how they stored it?
It's cheaper to produce, you can keep much more in there. And probably they had less interest in having 50-year-old wines. It wasn't something that the Roman Empire put an emphasis on as opposed to older empires. What is interesting, though, is that they describe boiling the wine in metal pots until it's reduced to maybe half or a third of its volume. Now, if these pots were lined with lead or made of leaded bronze, you're now introducing lead poisoning, which is far more deadly than you would think. Historians across Europe see that the use of metals and minerals, lead, copper, arsenic, mercury, which were used to improve colour and texture and shelf life. Eventually, there would be a 1498 papal bull in Rome which banned lead in wine. But the enforcement was quite weak, and you don't have any modern lab tests, so you couldn't prove the offence very easily. And in fact, many doctors still thought that small amounts of lead were either harmless or possibly even medicinal. But you take someone like Beethoven, his illness and early death, so his deafness in his late 20s, his recurring jaundice, point to lead poisoning from drinking wine for years. And more recently, they have done hair and bone analysis of Beethoven, which rendered lead concentrations many times the normal, and he spent a lot of money on wine, which we find in his accounts, so he could easily have ingested a number of milligrams of lead every day. And gout is another outcome. Port, other strong wines were triggers, and some historians have diagnosed Newton, King George IV, Tennyson, Handel with symptoms caused by poisoning of wine. So, going back to where we were in the line of production, we spoke about Rome and Greece, but the, so to speak, continuity of wine production is broken in Western Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. International trade disappears, and therefore we will skip to the 16th century for 2 or 3 more points about our introduction to wine. In the 16th century, which was a world of alchemy and intrigue, you have Tokai. And an Italian thinker spreads the word that the wines in Tokai actually contain gold. That he'd visited Hungary and there was gold ore in the hills, and that some of the vines even had gold shoots. So that was enough to convince people of its necessity, although probably the real second golden age of wines began with the Anglo-Portuguese trade in port after 1688, because French wines were expensive. There was heavy tax on it being brought into England. So the English signed a commercial treaty with Portugal, and they had to pay much less duty. and that led to a new age of wine, although the really big change comes through glass. In the 17th century, English bottle making produced stronger, darker glass, which could withstand pressure and long storage, and for the first time, cellars begin to store wines on their side, which keeps the cork in constant contact with the liquid, prevents it from drying out, from shrinking, and thereby letting in air, which would ruin the wine through oxidization. And that allowed wines like Bordeaux and Burgundy and others to be kept for decades. So thus far, a very brief history of wines. But now, an introduction to some basic halacha. In the days of the Mishnah, there was a pagan and idolatrous ritual to pour off wine from every bottle or barrel in honor of an idol. This made the wine biblically forbidden, all of the wine in there, even that which was not used, and that is what Yayin Nesech really means. It was poured out for the idol. But Chazal decreed that even wine produced by a non-Jew, or even kosher wine, which has been left unattended in the care of a non-Jew, is forbidden for drinking and benefit because it may have been poured for idolatry. And this rabbinic decree is called stam yeinam and treated as if it was Yayin Nesech. But what if the non-Jew who touched the wine was a monotheist and he would not serve any idols? So the rabbis still forbade drinking the wine because it could lead to intermarriage, and wine is the most social drink. It's the drink of romance. However, in the case of a monotheist, it's only forbidden to drink it, but you can benefit from the wine in other ways. Whereas, if the non-Jew is considered an idolater, then any wine touched by them can't be sold, given as a gift, or basically used for benefit. Now, it's true the touching has to be intentional, has to be direct action. There are various laws that apply to it, and it applies as soon as the wine begins to separate from the grapes, which we will discuss more next week when we have the appropriate people to address these questions too. And that produced a difficulty for Jews who would now be trading in wine in countries where the majority of the people around them were, let's say, Christian.
But just to clarify, the Gemara is dealing with pagan times and avodah zarah and the biblical prohibition on wine. These don't apply nowadays.
Correct, yes, biblically. But rabbinically, we do still have many restrictions. In practice, it's almost everything. And the halachic questions that arise today can often already be seen in the times of the Rishonim, the Middle Ages. We'll start with Ashkenaz France. After Charlemagne conquers territories in the north of France and Germany, in the 9th century, Europe's winemaking expands, especially along the Rhine, where Mainz and Worms are, and in regions like Champagne, where Rashi lived and his grandson Rabbeinu Tam, and we have maps that show an enormous overlap between vineyards and where the Ashkenazim lived. The problem was that the economy is plagued by a constant shortage of cash. There's no paper money, so money is made of silver. But this precious material is often earmarked for something else, for a church, and not for the production of coins. And therefore, in Europe, they didn't mint any gold coins for almost 500 years. And even when cash was available, the debts of a land-based and agricultural society are normally repaid in produce, which means farmers would borrow money when they are sowing their crops, and they would repay the debt at harvest time. And given that the main crop harvested in the Rhineland was wine, these debts were paid off in non-Jewish wine. And it's the Jews who've been lending them the money, or taking vineyards in pledges, or being the estate managers. So the Jews had no choice. They had to accept this wine in payment. But is it mutar ba'ana? How can you use it? We've just explained that it's forbidden. So now we come across a Kiddush which has far-reaching conclusions. Rashi and the Baalei Tosfos allowed non-Jewish wine, yayin stam, as debt payment. They didn't allow it as a commodity of trade. In other words, if the non-Jew has a debt, he can pay it off in wine, but Jews can't become wine traders.
Based on what source?
How did Rashi allow it? So there is a Teshuvot which Rashi quotes from the yeinam, and it's interesting. We don't paskin that way. We do not paskin like Rashi or Teshuvot today. We paskin like the Rashba, who would not allow this. The Teshuvot was that Christians nowadays no longer pour wine out to idols. They might be idol worshippers in other matters, but this is not something they ever do, so we can allow certain benefits. And Rashi's responsa is found in the Eora. You can take this wine as payment of debt, although Rashi tries to limit it to the harvest time. And then he has a second Kiddush. The domestic reality and necessity was that Jews were a tiny minority, and they relied heavily on Christians to run their households. There's no plumbing, electricity. It's a pre-industrial world, which means that Christian servants took part in almost every domestic task. So they will end up touching the wine. It's almost inevitable. And therefore he allowed some form of non-Jewish interaction. You can't hire non-Jews to tread the grapes, but you can have certain benefits. And in fact, Rashi's son-in-law, Rav Meir, sends a question to Rashi. This is very interesting because it must have been early enough in Rashi's life that he had not yet written Rashi on Masechtas Avodah Zarah. Because in that letter, Rav Meir asks his father-in-law to explain certain terms in the text of the Gemara, which are subsequently explained in Rashi's commentary. So we assume that he would have looked at it had he been able to. But here he is writing to his father-in-law, "Hi, Dad, can you explain to me not only this, but how we are having benefit from this wine?" And Rashi answers in brief. He says there's no difference actually between Yayin Nesech and Yayin Stam, but people have begun to be more lenient with it regarding having benefit.
Fascinating that he actually wrote that in the commentary. So it's a direct response to someone's curiosity, and we have that pirush still today.
Well, we have the answer still today, but we don't have within the commentary of Rashi on the Gemara the fact that he is talking to his son-in-law.
Right.
That we have from the Teshuvot that he wrote.
Not to go off topic, but was Rashi's commentary published in his lifetime?
Well, published. In other words, all these things are being handwritten. There is no printing. So the whole thing was written more than once, and his Talmidim then carry on writing out commentaries or copies for the next generations. But it won't be until the late 1400s that we actually have it printed.
Right. I mean, my point is that it's possible he had already written the commentary and just his son-in-law never saw it.
Potentially, yes, but he didn't live very far away, so,
Right.
He would have had a look. And then we have another psuk. Initially, the Gemara said, you can put a seal on a barrel, and that's the guarantee that it hasn't been opened by a non-Jew. But eventually in Ashkenaz, Rav Yitzchak, who is one of the Rabbeim of Rashi, required that besides for the seal, each barrel has to be wrapped in a sack. And his reasoning is very simple. In the times of the Gemara, wine was in earthenware vessels, and only through the tap could you reach the wine without breaking the vessel. So any attempt to get wine without breaking it would be easily detected. But European barrels were made of wood. And especially medieval barrels where the making was very poor, there were spaces between the pieces, the slats of wood, the staves as they are called, which had to be plugged in, and they used rags and grass and anything they had to hand. And therefore a non-Jew could easily insert a knife between these staves and take out some wine. So Yitzchak paskened that each barrel has to be wrapped in a sack and secured with a seal. And Rashi at first agreed. And over the years, he then concluded that his teacher's requirement was too stringent to be kept. And he wrote in a Teshuvah, in contrast to Rav Yitzchak's ruling, in our area, it has been the custom to import wine sealed with one seal, in other words, without the sack. We had followed the stringent practice for 10 or 15 years, but it's become progressively more difficult. The roads are bad. No one ventures abroad. In other words, there's no one bringing wine, and wine for Kiddush and Havdalah is lacking. So he paskens against his Rebbe because of the necessity of the times and of what he feels is a definition of Christian non-Jews which allows for certain leniencies. And you find Rabbeinu Tam, who's his grandson, who continues this from France, basically really into Germany, but his nephew, the Rav Yitzchak of Dampierre, wrote of one of these leniencies, I wish that the custom in such cases were to forbid, and it is unfortunately beyond my power, ein bekoichi, to forbid it, since the custom has been to allow it since the days of our teachers. He writes, Hayonira be'enei le'eser halavai. So you've got here, quite interestingly, we would have all thought, Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam and the Ri, they're all following one approach to halacha. Not at all. They are disagreeing with their own Rebbe when they feel that either they have sufficient reason to do so or sufficient proof to do so.
It's fascinating when you see Rashi's insight into Psak, into how they had to weigh up the circumstances of needing wine for Kiddush and Havdalah, which are very important mitzvahs, and continuation of, and versus the Isra of it, and everything has to be taken into account.
Yes, absolutely. In other words, you see that Rashi is not just relying on textual commentary that has been passed down to him, but he's looking at the circumstances and what is now a necessity and to what degree that has an effect on halacha itself. In fact, even the Ri eventually allowed debts to be paid off with wine received, although you couldn't do it repeatedly. In other words, you couldn't buy up many debts that would be repaid in wine because you then become a wine wholesaler. And there were sanctions against those who violated the restrictions. There were restrictions on Jews working as porters or brokers in connection with non-Jewish wine.
But Rashi himself was involved in the wine trade, wasn't he?
It's what we are always told. I don't want to destroy another legend here.
There's children's books about it.
Right, yes. And there is a tshuva from Rashi's, the Talmidim of Rashi, which mentions a wine barrel bearing Rashi's seal. So he definitely owned and identified, I guess, barrels of wine in his name, but it's unlikely that he owned a vineyard because the soil in that particular part of Champagne is more barren. So I'll leave that a little bit out there in the open.
And he wouldn't have owned a vineyard not near his home. They didn't do that those days.
They didn't move anywhere. I mean, they didn't move around. It would have been practically very difficult.
Right.
Especially because he was a Rosh Hashiva. Okay. We will now move south from Ashkenazic France to Provence and Languedoc. The Jews there lived in abundant wine-growing regions, the southern coast and the Rhone Valley, and almost every landowner owned a vineyard, and local wine was readily available. Now, the Rabbonim in Provence were stringent, unlike Rashi and Teshuvot, and they reject this idea that, debts can be paid in wine. They said any profit from non-Jews is forbidden. They did have one sort of vexing issue of their own, a drink made by mixing water with grapes that had already been pressed for wine, so a second pressing. Even where grapes and wine was plentiful, poor people were forced to resort to what was called piquet, which is probably the term temed in the Mishnah. And we have a case. In Béziers, a non-Jew poured water into the dried grapes and stems of a Jew on behalf of the Jew to make piquet. And the Rabbonim permitted it because you do not make a hagofen over this mixture, but a shahakol. This, in fact, is the ruling of the Raived's father-in-law, Rabbi Avram of Narbonne, who said that if there's 3/4 of it is water, it's fine, and you don't make a hagofen. The Raived was deeply uncomfortable with his father-in-law's position, and he voiced his opposition in what can only be called strong terms. And he writes, "My soul shudders at his ruling. For if he's correct, from now on, the non-Jew will go and pour water into our residual grapes and will serve us, and we will drink, and we will become almost a single nation." Now, the Raavad had the utmost respect from his father-in-law, but this was something he really wrote strongly against. And you have Rabbi Yitzchak Kimche in the 14th century. He is asked about the following case. A non-Jew bought the crops of a village from the Pope. And this non-Jew appoints 2 Jews to gather the crops and make the wine. And he told them to do so in what he called purity, because he wanted it to be sold to Jews. So the Jews did their work. They prepared the wine, they placed it in a cellar, and the key and the seal were in their hands. But the questioner says that there's no Jewish guard watching the cellar, and no Jews live in that particular village where the wine is being made, which means that there is opportunity for a non-Jew to enter the cellar somehow, even though the Jews had locked it. So he is unhappy about this wine being allowed, to which they responded saying that actually the grapes were owned by them, and Rabbi Yitzchak Kimche is convinced by their claim, and confirms that the wine is kosher. But this was a sort of an everyday reality for Jews there. And then you have questions of transport, export, really. Nowadays, many things come with a hechsher. The main reason it comes with a hechsher is because you're transporting it from one place to another. In those days, that wasn't the case. People ate things made locally, except for cheese and wine. And we actually find in the Geniza hechsherim for both. Now, wine would be transported. It would be taken by boats. So from the south of France, it would be taken through Mallorca, Barcelona. And if you've got a Jew who is the mashkiach on board, at one point he is going to go on shore to, stretch his legs, and he's leaving all the wine in the ship's hold. And because of that, they changed the hashgacha. They changed it to make the barrels of wine have an extra wooden seal, and all the openings are plugged up with sort of kosher signs. And the question is, does that replace a mashgiach? And within this tshuva, we find that the people say, we have added a small amount of honey to each barrel. You might wonder why. The answer is that the Rambam, Maimonides, is of the opinion that if you add honey to the wine, it removes it from being considered wine, although this psak is almost universally argued against by the Ashkenazim, by Rabbeinu Yonah, by the Ramban, by the Rashba, and therefore nowadays we don't paskin that way, nor back in the day then. Now, having spoken about Ashkenaz and southern France, in certain parts of Europe, supply meant that you couldn't always get wine. The Maram of Rothenburg was asked about whether beer can be used for Kiddush on a Friday night, because in his locality there's sometimes a lack of wine.
Probably true of England, where we obviously don't have grapes grown. They must have imported them.
Yes, in England they did import wine, but actually clearly not enough. I'm not sure why, but there was a general lack of wine in England. I corresponded with Dr. Pinchas Roth, who is the professor of Talmud at Bar Ilan, about the Jews of Provence, and he mentioned to me that there is a manuscript of a 12th century Seder produced in England with instructions for making Kiddush on Friday night without wine. And that Rav Moshe of London, who we spoke about in our 3-part series on medieval Jewry in England, in there, in the Eitz Chaim, you have instructions for conducting a Seder without wine. Very unusual. None of us would ever have seen it. And he writes there, Mi she'en lo yayin, somebody who hasn't got any wine, they start the Seder by washing their hands for matzah. And then they say the broch of hamotzi, and then make the rest of Kiddush, Asher Bochar Bonu, etc. And then at the end of Kiddush, they make the bracha alachilas matzah, and they eat matzah. That is their Kiddush. And then they take karpas. They're not going to now make a hardoma over the karpas, because they've already washed for matzah. And they continue through Magid until they end up with Goal Yisrael, the end of Magid.
But no broch at that point, because he has no wine.
Correct, yes.
And obviously when he finishes his meal, he benches with no kois. It's a whole different Seder.
Yeah, very different. And as I say, I don't believe any of us will have seen anything like it. But those are the instructions written. So clearly for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, to answer your question, England didn't manage to import that much wine. And during the year, English Jews drank beer, although strictly speaking it's probably ale, which is mentioned in Teshuvot, in Avodah Zarah, but obviously they couldn't do that on Pesach, and so Professor Roth believes that they drank apple cider.
Fascinating. Professor Roth, you said, is an expert in?
In medieval jewelry.
How did non-Jews react to be told, they must have known about this with all the stringencies in place, that if they touch the wine, it can't be used?
Right.
I can't imagine the Christian society took well to being defined as pagans.
It's true. I mean, Yayin stam is a classic example of what they called in silentia judorum, which translates from the Latin as Jewish chutzpah. And you have writers in the church writing with sort of bitterness that if a non-Jew touches it, it defiles the liquid. They didn't like it, and you even have one of the popes talking about it, but, halacha is halacha. But now we come to the Arab lands, and here there are big differences. First of all, the Muslims weren't allowed to drink wine, so there's no wine industry, and where it existed, it would have been in Jewish hands or the equivalent. And Muslims are not considered pagans or idol worshippers, according to all opinions. This is not just Rashi and Tosfos, but Provencal, everybody would have agreed.
Which is why one can enter a mosque.
Yes.
So are you saying that you can drink wine made by a Muslim, obviously if you know it's only kosher ingredients?
You still can't drink the wine, but you can have any type of benefit.
So selling and all that.
Yes, exactly. So from the time of the Pact of Omar, Muslims are not allowed to drink wine. It's mentioned already in the Quran, but it only really took hold in the 9th century. And at that stage, it's entirely forbidden. Even for non-Muslims, it is restricted to religious uses. And that means that obviously production and commerce in these countries is very limited, to the degree that at one stage, Reb Notroni Gaon is asked whether date wine can be used for Kiddush, and he says no. And there are, in fact, strong reactions to any wine being used in Muslim countries, even by non-Muslims, because it is assumed that it will be a bad influence on them, that, they're going to learn from the Jews. In 1414, the Mamluk Sultan told his subjects to look for any wine, any intoxicating drinks, and pour them out in the streets. In 1416, an annual tax was levied on all non-Muslims for permission to be able to drink wine at all. In 1428, there are instructions sent to Egypt and Syria and Eretz Yisrael to destroy all of it, and again in 1435, and it forbade drinking wine, even by Jews, in public, and any sort of public advertising of its sale. And this continues throughout Ottoman rule. We find that in Sharia court documents in 16th century Jerusalem. And the truth is that the Muslim rulers did have reason for concern because they weren't always followed. There is a German pilgrim who visits Egypt at the end of the 15th century, and he writes, many Muslims drink wine with the Jews, which obviously is a severe religious offense, but they do it anyway because it's tempting. And Jews didn't limit their own use of wine to religious ceremonies. The Bartanura writes in a letter from Yerushalayim to his father in 1488 that when he was on his way to Eretz Yisrael, he was in Alexandria, and after Kiddush and Shabbos, one of the leaders of the Jewish community served so much wine to everyone there that everyone got drunk.
The first Kiddush club.
Yes, exactly. And Jewish sources, especially Halachic ones, write that there was sale of wine to Muslims. The Radvaz, who's the greatest Egyptian Jewish scholar in the 16th century, says in the year 1545, 5305, a Muslim scribe called Ibn Ghazal sells wine from his home. Non-Jews buy it, they drink it there, and they become mishtakrim bebeisai. They get drunk while they're in his house. I guess they have to sober up before they walk back out into the streets, or they'll be picked up. But the most strange occurrence is there was a Muslim in Jerusalem who killed his own mother in anger, and when he's brought to trial, he says he acted under the influence of alcohol, and the judges decided that the local Jews and Christians are responsible because they're the only ones who make wine. So the Jews were fined 16 golden florins, the Christians were fined 12, and this Muslim guy went free. And just generally, bad harvests or plagues or drought, it was thought by the Muslims to be caused by the use of wine by Jews. And this, in this same letter, it says, when there is a dry spell and the cisterns dry up, the Muslims gather against us and spill out all our wine because they claim we've sinned. Although, from documentation in the Cairo Geniza, there are perhaps as many as 12 documents which point to commerce in wine as a Jewish occupation. Jews are investors, retailers, they're exporters, and we have one document of a partnership of 4 traders, 3 Jews and a Muslim. And then there's an extraordinary letter. It's extraordinary because of who it was written to. It's written by Rav Moshe Binyamin of Rosetta, which is on the Egyptian coast, and he is writing to the Arizal. And he says to him, Umitzad yenos, we had no purchaser willing to pay for the wine in cash, and so I sold it to Rabbi Yochum for payment due at the end of the month of Tishri, which is fascinating. And finally, we come to India. There's no community there, but there are traders who came from North Africa, and one of them has a luggage list in 1149, and it includes a bottle of kosher wine, because India's coast had no wine production at all, and this trader was there for many months, so he took some wine with him, but in correspondence he asks for raisins to be sent out to him. You can't ask for grapes, it won't survive getting there, but raisins, fine, and this guy's clearly religiously motivated. He asked a kasher about disembarking for Shabbos. And the last country that we come to is Italy, for which I'd like to thank another scholar in Bar Ilan, Professor David Malkiel. One of the greatest sources of controversy there was non-Jewish wine. And the main reason is because for most of that time, there wasn't a single unified country, so there was no sort of singular kehillah. And although Italian Jews had been there for centuries, they were numerically outnumbered initially by the Ashkenazim and then by the Sephardim, and later on, I guess you could say, rabbinically outnumbered. And in fact, many communities ended up as Sephardi even in the 1700s. Initially, the non-Jewish wine issue emerges in the 13th century in Italy with Rav Yeshaya de Trani, known to us as the Tosas Rid, who was the greatest scholar in 13th century Italy. But he would not rule. He writes quite sort of mysteriously that there is a great deal to say about the extent to which halachic stringency could be taken with regards to the wines of our kingdom, but he prefers to remain silent. Now, he understands how unsatisfying this reply is, so he adds, if you were with me face to face, I would tell you, but I won't do so in writing, for these matters are not to be written. And then he concludes with a sort of warning, do not investigate them and do not explore their finer points, which is very unusual, but that's what he wrote on the matter. And in his commentary to Avodah Zarah, he writes, like Rashi, that Christians do not perform this pouring out, this idolatrous libation, and they don't offer sacrifices to idols like the pagans of old. They just make wine into the blood of the Dark One. In other words, Yeshu in church, but that is only performed by priests and only in the abode of idolatry, the church, but never by other Christians or outside the house of worship, and therefore he rules that contact with Christian wine is permitted, although he says, I don't rely on this to issue a practical ruling. Shortly after he died, there was strong Christian conversionary pressure which decimated the Jewish communities of southern Italy, so Bari, Trani and others, and they were abandoned, and the survivors made their way north, and they established new communities in many of the smaller states. And now, in these places, you end up with Italian Jews living next to French Jews and German Jews, whereas they had lived according to one custom for many centuries. Now it changes, and the Ashkenazic legacy overpowers France and Italy. And you therefore have the deliberations about wine, which resume in the 15th century. The Maharik, who is the leading halachic authority in Italy, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz of Padua, who headed the leading yeshiva, he has a series of responsa, and he talks about the Jews of Bassano. During the grape harvest, the stopper, the bung, fell out of a relatively wide barrel, and a non-Jew placed his hand over the hole to prevent more wine spilling out. That was it. You couldn't drink any of the barrel anymore. And a barrel is, maybe 6 months of your supply. And when Rabbi Yehuda Mintz died in 1508, he is succeeded by the Maram Padua, who also writes Truvas. He wrote about a Venetian Jewish merchant who received from his sons in Candia, which is Crete, a shipment of non-Jewish wine to be sold to non-Jews. And that means you're getting benefit. So this question is put to the Maram, and it says that the rabbis in Crete couldn't protest this act of having benefit from non-Jewish wine because in this region, the great majority of Jews buy wine from non-Jews and they actually drink it, which is the first statement that testifies to the fact that in Italy, they often drank non-Jewish wine, something we'll come back to next week. So they couldn't protest it, and they asked the Maram Padua what to do. And then this guy contracted to sell large quantities of wine to local merchants. And the Maram says, you're right. As a payment of debt, you can use the wine, but you can't use it in commercial purchase and sale. And that really is an overview during the times of the Rishonim in particular of the questions they had to deal with in France, in Italy, in England, and it gives an insight into literally how they lived their lives on a daily, weekly, annual basis.
And it's fascinating because wine, as we said at the beginning, is the household Jewish staple that we use so much and so underappreciated. And I think the next time when I go to the local kosher supermarket and see the vast array of delicious wines, and you think the serious nefesh of being able to get wines, the different halachas that you had to go through, the questions that were asked, and a lot of the wine that we have today is thanks to the men that we will be interviewing next week, which we're looking forward to. And we'll, as I said, we'll be interviewing a halachic expert as well. We've left quite a few halachic questions unanswered, so don't go anywhere. Stick around for part 2. And if you have any questions that you're curious to ask one of the largest Jewish winemakers in the world, probably the largest, but we'll find out next week, and any halachic questions you've had, please send your questions to podcast@jli.org.uk, and we hope to ask them next week.